Hey there, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Now, the subject that I'm going to talk about today, it's not one I talk about quite so often. I'm often doing sessions to help people hire, but this is very much all about helping you to find a job. So we're going to be talking very much at the start of 2026 about job searching and why it feels harder, and leave you with a sense of what you can actually do to make an impact as you search for jobs over the next few weeks and months. If you're watching, then please feel free to drop in comments and questions along the way. There's a few reasons I thought it would be sensible to do this now. January is a big time. I know we're quickly hitting towards the end of it now. Is a big time for thinking about new jobs, searching for new jobs. My LinkedIn feed in those first couple of weeks was full of people getting new jobs, but I know there's also lots of people who haven't found something they're looking for yet and are putting in a lot of effort, not getting the return, or perhaps are unsure about where to start. As we stand in 2026, there's so many things about looking for a job that are the same as if I was doing this session 12 months ago or 2 or 3 years ago, but there is also a lot that is very different, and stuff that will have seemingly worked a couple of years ago, but now perhaps won't give you the same return. And there's a bit of pressure, I suppose, to do something. There's only a limit perhaps to some of the things you might be doing at the moment. So what is it you could do new and differently to make the impact you're looking for? So if you're not familiar with me, my name is Alan Fairley. I run a recruitment business called ISL Talent. Recruitment is where I spent my entire career, really. So I've hired for all sorts of companies, all shapes and sizes. At ISL Talent, for the last few years, we focus very much on venture-backed startups, so companies that are taking funding to scale. And over the 25 years or so I've worked in recruitment, I've helped hundreds, if not over 1,000 candidates get jobs. I've spoken to many more candidates than that about their work search. Sometimes we've been able to help them directly with finding them a role, but often it's the advice, and some of which I'll talk about today, that comes up in the conversations I have. And I know that I am guilty of not responding to every LinkedIn message that I get through. I do get numerous ones through from candidates, and I can't speak to every candidate, which is another reason why I thought it was sensible to do this session today. So let me just make sure that the technology seems to be working. It's all good and up and running. And like I say, I'll leave some time at the end for questions, but if there are any comments you want to chip in on the way, hopefully they'll show up here as we go. And the structure I'll run through today will be probably in 3 main parts. So talking about why job searching does feel harder as we come into January 2026. Why simply applying for jobs alone is working less and less, and not something you can rely on like you could have maybe done once upon a time. And then finishing with what I'd focus on personally if I was looking for a job today, to hopefully give you some clear takeaways to think about what you can do, either double down on that you're already doing at the moment, because I'm sure there's some good stuff there, but also what you could think about doing differently if you're perhaps feeling a little bit lost on where to go next as you search for a new role. And maybe help you to understand sort of how hiring actually works. So to begin with, to sort of set the scene for what I see, where we are working on roles every day, talking to candidates, talking to founders, and also investors and other people that will sit around the startup board table to help companies think about scaling. And a big part of that is team. Well, the world of hiring, I suppose, often, in my view, gets conflated with job adverts. But let's start with job adverts before we talk about other parts of that process. Now, our own data shows that in a 12-month period last year, we were seeing 297 applications on average for each of our jobs. So every time we post a job, we get an average of 297 applications. Sometimes it's less than that. Sometimes it's 500-600 people that are applying for a job. Now that is a significant increase on what we would have seen in the previous 12-month period. I talk to founders, some of which work with ISL Talent, some of which are doing things directly themselves, and a similar picture emerges. Post an advert, what used to happen if you've written a good advert, you're really pleased to get in lots of applications. now almost by default, good advert or bad advert, you will be seeing applications in the hundreds. So the volume of applications has massively increased. That's partly because more people may be out there looking for work. It's also because there are people out there that are perhaps exactly as I would do, using ChatGPT, tools like Lazy Apply to power their job applications. So whereas previously they were maybe able to get out 10 or 20 applications in a day, they can now multiply that by 10 or 20 times itself. So maybe 100, 200, 400 applications you can get out as a candidate searching for work. So in terms of the activity coming into jobs, it's massively spiked. Those numbers have gone up and up. But the other side of the equation, there's no way that capacity the other side has gone up by the same degree. And in many cases, it's dropped. So internal talent teams, many companies have made those redundant as their hiring plans have scaled back and they're looking to build leaner teams. Founders are perhaps not hiring those internal people early to help with their recruitment. Maybe they're cost conscious, they're not using external partners. And even the recruiters themselves, their teams are perhaps smaller than they were. So whichever way you look at it, the teams that are looking at the applications are dropping down. So you've got that balance where we've got much more applications coming in and much less resource, the other side of things. So there's a sense of overwhelm, I suppose, if you're at the receiving end of running a hiring campaign and relying on job adverts and faced with 297 applications, you don't know where to begin. Some companies, of course, will employ their own AI and algorithm-based decision-making to filter through. And in reality, that's relying on words to a page, which are not always the best reflection of where the real value is in a candidate, but you can't talk to all those candidates. So what happens is that unless you are a real spot-on match on paper to the job spec, you probably won't get a phone call like you would have done 2 years ago. And that's really frustrating applying for jobs, where you're applying for these jobs manually or in an automated way or some sort of hybrid, and you're just not getting the feedback. Those CVs are going into a void. And the reality is many of them will be ignored unless you are perfectly demonstrating you've got the track record they're looking for. So if you're thinking about shifting careers, or you're looking for a role that doesn't look on paper like it's textbook for you, even if you believe if you have that conversation with the founder or the chair, you could demonstrate your value, the reality is you probably don't get to that point. So you may already have understood that in terms of the picture, but hopefully it helps to kind of think about how that might have changed. And as part of that, people are hiring less, no doubt. There's some companies that are absolutely flying and hiring, but for many companies, they're thinking about hiring 2 or 3 people rather than 10 or 12 people. And each hire is going to matter more. So there's a risk aversion there to making the wrong decision, which causes some people to hesitate and procrastinate. So the hiring processes themselves can often slow down and people aren't necessarily sure which way to turn. A lot of the time at IS Have Talent, if we're introduced to or working with founders, it will be to give them that clarity to begin with on what they're looking for, so they can then run a process with velocity and move candidates through in a timely manner. But a lot of founders, particularly first-time founders who are hiring for a sales role for the first time or a head of engineering, they've never had one before, they're really nervous about jumping too quickly into making decisions. And as a candidate, you will feel the pain of that in terms of decisions slowing and decisions not being made as quickly as you might want them. So in summary, I suppose activity has spiked in terms of volume of job applications being made, capacity hasn't, and there's also perhaps situations where people aren't able to or willing to move as quickly as they might have done previously. A big part of where this challenge comes from is that people do, as I touched on earlier, think about hiring as job adverts. And one key thing I want you to understand is that they are not one and the same. If you're looking for a job, you need to look at adverts that are out there, but you also need to think differently about where you can look for the opportunities. Job adverts feel like they're the safest thing to focus on, but increasingly they're a real noisy channel that isn't going to give you the return they would have done 1 or 2 years ago. So if you're sitting there at the moment thinking, I've tried really hard in the last week to look for jobs, but 95% of your activity is applying for job adverts, it's not that you haven't worked hard, it's that you need to think differently about where you're putting your effort, and a big part of that is varying the efforts. Now, that is more of a problem now, but 5, 10, 15 years ago, the majority of hires weren't made via job adverts. So it's always been a big part of the picture that so many jobs are through warm connections or through one step removed in your network rather than through an advert. So many jobs get hired through recruiters. I can think of 2 or 3 roles in the last couple of months that we've put candidates in where we haven't gone out and put an advert because we've known somebody that we've been able to plug straight into a role. I see it numerous times with the founders and the investors I work with, where they will bring someone in from their network, or they will put word out in their network without necessarily advertising a role, and a hire gets made. So the research suggests that anywhere between 65 and 80% of job adverts, so 80% of hires are not made through job adverts. So if 80% of your activity is focused on job adverts, hopefully this is a signal that you need to shift that focus and not stop applying for adverts, but make sure you're doing much more variety. So that could be people that you know, that could be referrals, recommendations, could be through recruiters. And I'll talk a bit more about some of the different tactics you might employ in a minute. The key thing is here is that if you're only applying to adverts, you are missing a big part of the market, and you need to think differently about where you're putting your efforts in. At the moment, if you're only in that space, you're competing in the real crowded part of the market. And my expectation, for what it's worth, over 2026 is it'll be increasingly crowded. The volume of applications is going to go up and up. The ability to hire well, relying on job adverts, is going to go down and down. So as a candidate looking for work, you need to adjust to that. And so one of the reasons that this doesn't work is the activity you're putting into applying for job adverts. It rarely compounds. So you see a job advert today, you apply for it, it's quite a binary outcome. You either get an interview, get some traction, maybe get a job, or you don't. Most hiring campaigns aren't set up to give any long-term value to the client or to the candidate. So you're applying for job adverts, maybe you get a return, but it's not an activity that compounds in value. Whereas if you start to do some of the things that I'll talk about in a minute, those are the real compounding activities. The activities that will give you an increased return, whether or not they get you, excuse me, an immediate result, they will give you long-term return, and not just for this current job, but also for the future jobs to make it easier for you next time. So tweaking the wording of your CV, yes, you can put it into ChatGPT and improve it. You can talk to people and get some feedback. You can look more closely at the background to the company and think about what is it you really need to highlight in that application there. But these things aren't going to move the dial. They're not going to give you a return in a measurable way versus some of the things that I'll talk about. The compounding activity that you need to be thinking about, if you're not already, is in reality exactly the same as if you were running a sales process. You wouldn't focus only on the customers that are looking to buy right now. You would build up the people that aren't raising their hand in the market, in this case by posting an advert, but are perhaps in the mood for buying right now, or maybe in the near future, but aren't signaling that in the same way. So like a sales process, if you're thinking crudely about selling yourself, part of that is outreach, and not to the obvious suspects, not to the people that are advertising the jobs. So that could be outreach to companies that you know of, people in your industry, places where former colleagues are working, high growth lists, businesses that are working in incubators, accelerators that have taken funding. All of those things are going to give you a mixture of warm connections and contacts, or signals that companies are in growth mode. And a big part of how you'll find a job, not relying on adverts, is by building relationships. So that might be rekindling the relationships that you had from a colleague of 3, 4, 5 years ago. It might be building new relationships with founders, building early in the space that you are really drawn towards. It could be through people that had invested in your previous business or had worked with one of your former colleagues that are now growing something new. You can start to develop a relationship with them. So I could arguably do a whole session just on networking, but one of the key things there is combining networking with the outreach point of view. Back to the networking side, then events are a big part of how you'll find people out there that are developing new technologies, that are pitching for funding, that are looking to go on a growth journey. And that's one of the ways in which you'll find the people that are looking to build. And as part of that, will be looking to increase their team as they go. It's about being visible in the right places and staying front of mind when someone starts to think about employing a chief technology officer or a head of sales or a marketing manager, that they are thinking about you as someone they should talk to about this, or someone that is a connection between the two of you would throw your name up as part of the conversation. And that conversation is sometimes never leading to a job advert being posted, but is often in advance of a job advert being posted. So that relationship building is the real compounding activity versus the much more transactional applying for jobs that is super important. Now, some candidates I've spoken to have a very strong system where they will methodically go through 5, 10, 20 activities a day to build their network and get referrals and recommendations. Others will make sure they put 30% of their time next week, however you are allocating that, into networking versus applying for jobs. And others will just make sure it's an intent they're waking up with each day to go out there and build some network and build some warmth and stay front of mind. Whichever route you travel, just make sure, I suppose, that it's something that you are keenly you are focusing on as part of your job searching efforts. And that's about staying front of mind. I think another big part of it is to give founders, or I talk about founders because that's the world that we work in, but people that are hiring managers, people that are leading the teams that you want to be joining in the future. It's about giving them confidence that you are somebody with that trust and credibility. And going back to the job advert, standing out as one of 297 people is really challenging. Whereas if you've shown up time and time again, whether that's online or in person, if you're proactively outreaching to these people that aren't hiring right now, but will be in 2 weeks, 2 months, maybe a bit longer, you are front of mind to them. And you need to make sure that they have the confidence to be able to turn to you with the problem they're looking to solve, rather than simply filling a job. So a big part of that is making sure that you are presenting the value you can add. So I see hundreds and hundreds of CVs, and as I've talked about, this isn't a session where I'm necessarily going to give you 10 top tips to improve your CV. But one of the things that I often see as a mistake is the CV, if I'm the buyer of that service, if I'm a hiring manager, doesn't really give me a sense as to what you can do for me. If I talk to candidates and say, what did you do in your last job? They'll say, this is the situation when I joined, and I took them through a journey and got them to this point. Or they'll say, this is a key challenge when I joined, and I overcame that opportunity or that challenge and got them to this point. And I look at their CV, and it's a bland and boring representation that looks more like a job description than tells me the journey, the story that they would give me in person. And you can bring those lessons into your CV, but also when you're meeting people in person, a big part of telling your story is giving them a sense of the value that you have and could provide. So when you're out there networking, when you're connecting with people, it's helping them understand the journey you can take businesses on, the impact you can make in your role, make that tangible, link it both into what you've done previously and what you want to do in the future. And that's how you will cut through the noise, both in terms of job applications, but also when you're trying to stay front of mind and not relying simply on job adverts. And I think what you need to make sure you're doing as part of that is getting into the right rooms and putting effort. And sometimes that might be rekindling old relationships. Sometimes it's moving into new circles and new spheres. Go out there and talk to people that are key ecosystem contacts in whatever region you are looking to develop your relationships. That could be a geographical relationship in terms of industry, in terms of technology. So in Bristol, which is where I'm based, there's some really strong people that are part of the ecosystem. And although they may not be hiring you directly, they'll be talking to other businesses, to founders, to investors, the people that are driving the growth of these businesses. And they'll be able to give you a sense as to who's emerging, perhaps hidden under the radar, that might be looking to hire and build their team. So it's really important not to simply think about this is a company I want to work for, but think about those broader connections. Again, going back to a key point, as you would see with networking, it's being clear on your ICB, your ideal customer, or in this case, the business you want to work for, but also thinking about the partners and the people that have relationships with those that are able to connect you in. So hopefully I've given you a sense as to why job adverts are still effective in some cases, but not something that you can rely on. I've helped you to understand, if you were sat in the shoes of a hiring manager, a founder, or a business leader, why job adverts are going to give you a lot of noise, and as a candidate, why it's difficult to cut through that noise. And I suppose we've talked in a few different ways about the impact of networking and going out there to uncover the hidden jobs and making sure you're staying front of mind. A big part of how I would do that, if I was looking for work at the moment, I wouldn't simply go out there asking for jobs. I would look at the, maybe there's 2 or 3 things I would do. I would go and speak to the warmest connections I have. So there's 10, 20 people that I really trust. Go and sit down and have a coffee with them, grab a lunch and ask for their advice. I would widen that out to people that I don't know so well, maybe doing some cold outreach. Again, I'd be starting with asking for advice rather than asking for a job. And then I would think about the people that I don't really have any connection to, that might be out there at pitch events, that are showcasing their technology, that are on those high growth lists or working with incubators and accelerators. And perhaps for them, it's thinking about how I can add value. But that mixture of asking for advice and adding value is very different than simply sending a CV. And it's much more likely to lead to coffees, referrals, conversations that will lead to opportunities where you may well get a job that doesn't ever go to an advert, or if it is going to advert, you're already in prime position to be able to get your foot in the door and show that you're the person that they're looking for. I would focus on impact over job titles and years of experience. I would focus really on, particularly in the startup world, around your ability to be flexible and adaptable. There's a lot of change that founders of early stage businesses are working through at the moment. So although they may have particular tools they're looking for you to work for, your ability to problem solve, collaborate, communicate, and be curious are a big part of where the best hires are going to be aligned. And I would really focus on your relevance, which is difficult when you perhaps don't have only one type of business you're looking to work for. But going back to the earlier point around how you're taking people from where they are now to where they could get to in the future, what are the hurdles, the objections, the challenges, the inflection points that you are helping people to overcome and get through? So my hope is that there's something in what I've covered today that will give you a bit more confidence and clarity as you're going about searching for work. If you've got any other comments or questions, then feel free to add them into the video. Even though it's not live, I can revisit and make sure that I follow up on any kind of key points. Feel free to send me a message on LinkedIn, although like I said, sometimes it's challenging to come back to all the candidates approach me, but maybe there's a role we've got coming up, maybe there's somewhere that I can signpost you to help. And the bit that I will come back to, which hopefully has been a key thread that has been coming through this, is that job adverts are not the only thing to rely on when you're looking for work. There are a multitude of things you're doing. There is going to involve a certain amount of experimentation and variety, but it's very much about increasing your surface area of luck, so that if we were to chat in 3 months' time and you've managed to get the role you're looking for, there's a good chance it's because you've done a multitude of things to improve your chances rather than relied on one particular channel. So thanks for tuning in, and look forward to hearing from you in the future.